Okay. So thank you all for coming. I'm just going to talk through today a kind of case study of what I think an example of decolonising the curriculum might look like. I teach international relations and politics here at DMU in this building. I'm based up on the 6th floor. And I've taken over a module since I joined DMU a couple of years ago, and I've been trying to kind of institute a variety of changes to that module, but also to the wider student experience of the cohorts that I'm working with that are kind of under this banner of decolonising the curriculum. So I just want to kind of explore some of those changes I've made, the kind of rationale for making them, and some of the feedback that I've had from students through action research that I've done afterwards as a consequence on, I guess, how effective those changes have been, or how they've received them, how they think about them, and how I might think about taking it forward. This is the kind of structure of what I'm going to talk about. The first part, why decolonise the curriculum, I'm just going to race through really. I think this is probably a fairly sympathetic audience to the rationale for decolonising curricula. But I think it's useful, again, to rehearse some of the reasons why decolonisation is an essential project in higher education in the UK today. If nothing else, as a kind of tool for engaging with students around the issue. I'm then going to spend most of the presentation talking about this kind of practical question of what might it look like to decolonise the curriculum in a particular disciplinary area, or subject area. I'll first very briefly introduce the kind of dimensions of the case study that I'm talking about, and then I've got three sections. One on decolonising the classroom, where I'll be talking about the kind of module level changes that I've introduced. One on decolonising beyond the classroom, which is about kind of extracurricular reading groups that I've been organising, connected with this kind of decolonising programme. And then lastly, about decolonising beyond the university, where I'm just going to talk briefly about trying to reshape the discipline itself. The bit I want to spend most time on, not least because a lot of the student response chimes very closely with a lot of what Silhouette just said in her keynote, is the student response. So I'm going to run through a selection of quotes from some focus groups that I carried out with BAME students who were enrolled on that module over the last 2 years, and then I'll briefly have some kind of conclusions at the end. So why decolonise the curriculum? I guess the first thing is that we need to accept that higher education curricula are colonised in the first place, and this takes a variety of different forms. In the discipline that I'm based in, politics and international relations, it generally takes the form of the fact that when we think about theory, especially, and the module that I'm going to be referring to in this presentation is a module on international relations theories, we tend to think of it through this Western canon, through an idea, a narrative about political thought which stretches from kind of ancient Greece to the present day via a bunch of other dead white men, kind of great European white thinkers. And in doing so, I think does two things. That narrative, and it is a narrative rather than a simple kind of historical reality, first of all erases the contribution to political thought generally, to global social and political thought, but also to the thought of these kind of great white men that we tend to introduce students to, that we traditionally introduce them to. It erases the contribution to that thought of scholarship from scholars who are not white. So in the case of political philosophy, those kinds of exclusions might include people like Confucius or Ibn Rushd, without whose contributions the thought of many Western European political philosophers would simply not have been possible, and who directly took and adapted and appropriated the work of those scholars from the global south and so on. So there's that kind of exclusion on the one hand, or erasure of non-white scholarship on the one hand, and on the other hand, that kind of narrative about political theory and the history of theories of international politics frames those white European thinkers in a sanitized kind of light, and carefully kind of steps around and avoids confronting some of the less wholesome kind of ideas that some of those thinkers held. So, for example, in international relations, a great example is someone like Immanuel Kant, Prussian philosopher, who is generally depicted in international relations theory as being a naive, utopian, almost benevolent liberal, in contrast to the kind of realism of people like Machiavelli or Thomas Hobbes. But Kant was also an Enlightenment scientific racist who wrote tracts on the kind of various races of the world and their capabilities intellectually and so on. So that's the kind of traditional way of teaching political theory and as a consequence also international relations theory. So the curriculum is colonised, I guess, in my discipline in that particular kind of way, but I think we can find parallels across most disciplines in the humanities and social sciences and beyond. So to think about why we decolonise the curriculum, kind of got to begin from the premise that it is colonised and that work needs doing. And then I think there are two kind of broad categories that come to my mind at least, and I don't think there's a kind of right answer to this, but I think there are two broad categories of reasons why it's essential then to do this work. The first are what I would call kind of ethical or social justice imperatives. Among those would be things like an anti-racist ethics, the idea that it is a good in itself to be opposed to racism because racism is about dehumanisation and subsequently murder, extermination, genocide and so on. So an anti-racist ethics is not a very difficult thing to argue in favour of, in a sense. The second kind of line of argument would be about inclusivity. This is a post-92 university. About 50% of the student body here identifies as black, Asian or other minority ethnicities, higher than the kind of, well, a lot higher than the national average in higher education and especially in the kind of pre-92, let alone the Russell Group part of the sector. We're working with a student body that is actually much more diverse than our staff body, and I'll come back to that towards the end. And there is therefore a kind of duty placed on us to ensure that those students feel represented, that they feel like they've got points of contact and understanding in the university. And lastly, under that kind of ethical and social justice imperatives, you might think about this as part of post-colonial reparations. The colonisation of people's minds, as Ngugi wa Thiong'o would put it, was part of the material colonisation of territories, of economies, and of bodies around the world as well. And so we haven't reached decolonisation if we haven't got through the decolonisation of knowledge, of curricula as part of that. And then I think there are a set of epistemological and scientific imperatives for decolonising curricula. And the limited experience I've had so far of making these changes to the module, I've found that these arguments can be particularly useful for engaging with students who are perhaps inherently resistant to the idea of decolonisation, to, I would say, especially white students who have perhaps been engaged to some extent in the kind of political culture wars that are taking place at the moment, whose eyes roll when I mention decolonising in the first week of term, who I can see are intrinsically a little bit hostile to some of these issues, and especially to talking about race and racism, and to centering race and racism in discussing international relations and in discussing theory and theorisation. Because what these kind of arguments give us, and I've given a few examples here of concepts that are useful for making these arguments, is a language with which to say, well, actually, this is not simply an ethical or political question. It's also a question about epistemology, about knowledge. You're going to have an incomplete knowledge of the world if you choose to ignore the thinkers who actually shaped the kind of theories that we're engaging with here. And I think there's plenty of work in post-colonial theory, equally in black feminist thought, and the work of bell hooks and others, that points to this idea that really one way of framing decolonisation that's helpful for dealing with that kind of resistance is that it's around redressing biases that have informed ways of teaching and knowing in our society. That's problematic in the same ways that Silhouette implied earlier around a kind of allegedly apolitical form of education, but it can be a useful argument. So what can decolonising the curriculum look like? Basically, the kind of premise for this presentation and the kind of draft paper that sits behind it is that while I think decolonising, a lot of people are sympathetic to it in principle, one thing that I've noticed, and I'm sure some of you have too, is particularly on social media, not on a lot of social media, but I do use Twitter quite a lot. You tend to see every time there's a bit of a debate, usually say there's an article in The Guardian about decolonising, which happens on a fairly regular basis now, once every few months. You'll tend to see some kind of debate around it, and one of the things that particularly white male academics seem to say is, well, what would that look like? How could I do that? Or I couldn't do that in my discipline. I understand why you want to do it, and maybe it will work here or it will work there, but how would I do it? Often demanding this of BAME colleagues, in fact, and kind of adding to that sort of additional volunteer workload that is expected of BAME colleagues in redressing their own inequalities, the inequalities that they experience in higher education. So the idea was basically to just say, well, here's what I've been doing as an example of how you might try to practically implement some of these changes, to think about what it means to decolonise a curriculum. I don't think that there's, a kind of right or wrong answer to this, and a lot of the opinion pieces and debate around decolonising at the moment are about what really constitutes decolonisation. In particular, I think a lot of people have been wanting to highlight that it's not enough to change a reading list, because that's been taken to be the kind of all that's necessary. So the case study is based on a small action research project that I've done as part of my postgraduate certificate in learning and teaching over the last year here at DMU, where I kind of explored the changes I had made completely, well, separately from that PG cert, through a set of focus groups, small focus groups with students, BAME students, who had taken this module, Themes and Debates in Contemporary International Relations Theory. I spoke to two groups, one that had taken it in 2017 to 18 before I introduced the changes that I'm going to be talking about today, and one group that had taken it this academic year, 2018 to 19. So those were third years who were just graduating now. Or rather the other way around, the 17-18 group are now the third years who've just graduated, to try and get an idea of kind of the impact, I guess, of the changes that I've made. And the idea that was informing, I guess, or a guiding kind of definition for thinking about the curriculum that was informing my approach to designing changes and then to reflecting on those changes comes from this. This was actually just a blog on the conversation by Moreira and Luckett from the University of Cape Town, who argued that the curriculum is not just the stuff that students must learn to be knowledgeable and skilled in a particular discipline. It's about more than just content. Curriculum is a highly ideological hybrid discourse. And this means it includes implicit ways of knowing, ways of doing, and ways of being, as well as content. So in terms of the changes that I made to the module, with that in mind, and with a view to trying to decolonise, yes, I changed the reading lists extensively, so tried to incorporate both more BAME intellectuals based in the West, but also more non-Western scholarship, into that kind of existing reading list to make sure that it wasn't just a list of sort of dead white men, but there were also a series of changes I made to the, for example, the structure and content of the module. So rather than beginning by talking to this, on the left-hand side is a column of the lectures from the 2017 to 18 version of the module, and then this is the 2018 to 19 version, just the beginning part. It's a full year-long module, so that's just kind of the first term from each one. So rather than beginning by talking about kind of ancient Greeks, which is what we did up until 2017, started by talking about people like Thucydides, and then working our way through realist and liberal, but basically white Western, white Eurocentric theories, working towards somewhere down, it's not quite on there because it doesn't come around till about April probably, that we would look at post-colonialism, that we would have the first conversation about race in a year-long module, and the international politics of race. So for 2018 to 19, I started with a lecture that tried to use contemporary issues, in this case Brexit, Trump, Black Lives Matter and Me Too, to think about why we need theory in international politics, but also to get the students understanding that when we theorise international politics, when we try to explain it, these are the kinds of issues we want to be able to explain and understand better. I would say that's the simplest level of change. I then restructured the order of some of the, so we still had a lot of the kind of traditional theories, if you like, and the white theory in the first term. In the second term, when we began talking about critical theory, the tradition when you engage with critical theories in teaching politics and international relations is you start with Marxism, then you move to post-structuralism, and then right at the end you have the kind of add-ons of feminism, post-colonialism, you know, the kind of niche interest subjects as they're represented. So instead of that, I flipped it around, and in the second term we begin with feminism, then post-colonialism, and Marxism comes later on, because I think the way I tried to pitch this to the students was, if we're thinking about which theories carry water today, which theories are influential today, which theories are central to these kinds of debates and these big political issues, Marxism is not really right at the heart of some of those things. It maybe intersects with some of the theories that are right at the heart of those debates, but things like feminism and post-colonialism might be more relevant. But I would say that this kind of was the simplest set of changes, was just basically restructuring, widening, broadening reading lists, and so on. Then in terms of the delivery of content, I kind of had a go at going through the module and reframing some of the thoughts. So I mentioned Immanuel Kant earlier. Well, rather than just presenting his theory of cosmopolitanism and his idea about citizens of the world and kind of the Enlightenment man as the, the future of the world, I kind of reframed that, explaining that when he talked about cosmopolitanism, when he talked about what became human rights, essentially, this idea of universal human rights, he always meant it actually in a very specific and constrained way. It only ever applied to white Europeans in his mind. And he wrote explicitly on that topic, excluding a variety of other people in the world from this kind of Enlightenment project because they were essentially subhuman in his view. And this was common to a lot of Enlightenment thought. So adding this kind of reframing to the existing curriculum, I guess, as we go through and talk about it. But the most important change, I think, that I made to the module this year, and the one that, as you'll see when I talk about the focus groups in a minute, was best received maybe, was to the assessment. So in line with a lot of important work, I think, that's being published on pedagogy at the moment around the use of reflective writing and reflective speaking in higher education, in assessment, and its centrality actually to challenging racist norms and challenging whiteness in the university and institutional racism. We got rid of one of the essays on the module and introduced a new assessment which was called a critical reflection and dialogical presentation. Students were required to write a 500-word, non-academic, as in they didn't need to abide by academic writing standards, they didn't need to use references, 500-word, quite personal critical reflection on an issue that they were allocated. Half the students were allocated the issue of the election of Donald Trump and its implications for international politics, and the other half were allocated the issue of Brexit and its implications for international politics. And in that 500 words, the only thing they had to abide by was a structure, which was that they could spend about 100 words talking about kind of their initial reaction to that event and their initial feelings, their kind of gut feeling, I guess, about that event. In the second 100 words, they could talk about whether or not any of the theories we'd encountered in the module so far were useful to understanding or explaining that event or not. And then the last part, which was to be 300 words, they were asked to think about your own circumstances and life experience and how this might have shaped how you think about both the allocated issue and the theories or concepts that you have spoken about in the previous section. And we give examples of things like where you come from, geographically, socioeconomically, in terms of your family or class background, your identity, gendered, race, ethnicity-based, religious identity, disabilities, or other aspects of your sense of self. So the students basically had to write this 500-word piece talking about the issue and then talking about how they, how they felt their conditioning, their background might have shaped how they think about that issue. And then they had to present them in class in small panels, so I'd have maybe 3 or 4 students at a time in the seminars presenting to each other, and then have a whole class discussion around that. Before I come back to the focus groups, there were 2 other kinds of ways in which I've been trying to institute changes through this year that I think fall under decolonising the curriculum. So those were the module level changes. What I've run up against, and I think everybody will run up against if you seriously are interested in decolonising the curriculum in a university, is the barriers to making real fundamental change to the ways in which you engage with students in the classroom. So another kind of side project allied to this was, through this year, we ran a reading group on the book Natives, Race and Class in the Ruins of Empire by Akala. I was reading the book as I was rewriting the module guide last summer in June, and had this idea maybe it would be good to have something extracurricular where students weren't constrained by assessment, where they weren't constrained by the normal ways of being in a classroom with a lecturer that Silhouette was referring to this morning, I think. So we organised this reading group, got 4 students who were willing to lead the reading group, and my role in the group was really to act as an administrative support to the students who were the academic leaders of the group. So they led the conversation and facilitated the conversation. We had a meeting about once every 2 to 3 weeks, so it's quite a light reading load. It's a very accessible book, kind of non-academic, but very much scholarly and well-researched and thorough and well-argued. A really powerful book that engages with a lot of really interesting topics, but particularly centres race and racism. So that was something that we kind of did outside, and that was very well received by the students, and the students who led it were excellent. And we're going to be rerunning it again this year. These were the 4 texts that we gave the student reading group leaders a choice of for this year, and the one that they've gone with actually is British by Afua Hirsch. So that will be this year's kind of reading group. Even beyond that, and I'm going to kind of just skip ahead to the focus group so I can just show you a few of the quotes before I'm out of time from those students. But I think there's also a broader task of, well, how do you really decolonise a discipline? It's not really going to kind of work on a macro scale, decolonising by thinking about module level changes. It's all a version of just changing reading lists, essentially, even if you're changing your assessment and you're making these other kind of micro level changes. So I've, as of this year, just been engaged by Palgrave to write an update to this textbook on global politics, where basically my proposal was to make some pretty dramatic changes to the content of that textbook, which currently is called Global Politics, but is really about the politics of the Western world and takes a very Eurocentric kind of perspective. So I think there's space for thinking about how do you decolonise your discipline while rewriting textbooks is one way to kind of get that undergraduate education changed, and as a consequence change scholarship and research and teaching as well. The response to this, I'm just going to very briefly run through pick out a few kind of choice quotes for 1 minute, because I know I've gone a little bit over. On decolonising the content, this was the group who took the module in 2017 to 18, so before the changes were made. One of them talked about feeling like they were expecting it to be about the whole world, but they feel like, if anything, the course is international relations in the Western world. Another one talked about it being just like very standard Western ideology. And this was from a focus group of 4 BAME students who had taken the module in the previous academic year. In terms of the classroom experience, that same cohort of students talked about, I think, quite common experiences from black students of being actually singled out by lecturers, not in this particular module, but in modules that they had taken, and asked, oh, well, what's your take on slavery, for example, as that student said, as if I'm supposed to speak for all of the slaves that came before me. They also talked about the whiteness of the university, and I think this is the most fundamental issue that came back again and again through the focus groups, was, as one student put it, how do you expect us to be comfortable as the minority when all of our lecturers are white? This also chimes quite strongly with this research that came out in The Guardian in July this year, where they did a big survey asking students about decolonising, asking them about race and racism in universities, where students talked about the fact that the lack of diversity among academic staff at their university led them to describe a sense of isolation because of the absence of any shared lived experience with those teaching them. That was something that came through very strongly from the focus groups that I carried out as well. I think the most powerful for me comment came from a student from that same cohort, and I think while some of the issues here might have been partially addressed by the efforts that I've made so far, these are the really big challenges. One student said that they have a problem with typical academic essay writing because I feel like it boxes people in, and that's not necessarily how everyone expresses themselves. They're not allowed to see their potential because they're being told their ways of doing things are incorrect. And she says, in the 3 years at uni, that's the one thing I've come to find out, that the academic style of writing is white. That's the easiest way for me to describe it. It's very white. And then she goes on to talk later in the interview about marking and assessment, and she says that she feels like there is this type that they are looking for, the markers. It's like an unwritten type, and when they don't see that type, it's like, okay, this person's not that good, they're not that smart, this is the grade that they deserve. And she says this is a repetitive culture, and because we are different, our backgrounds are different, and we express ourselves in different ways, she feels that she would be excluded from getting the marks that she feels she deserves. There is some positive impact recorded from the cohort for this year, but I'm kind of out of time, and I think it's actually more important to think about the students' critique of the changes that were made. And I would just finish by saying the kind of key barriers then that come up for me, they were mostly things that Silhouette talked about this morning, in particular the kind of whiteness of universities as institutions, and most importantly, most materially, the fact that universities are still failing to hire and promote BAME staff, academic staff, and this is not something that can be solved at the level of making changes to your reading list or your assessment, unfortunately. I'll leave it there. Sorry, I've gone a few minutes over.
Thank you.